Hi everybody. What I'd like to do quickly is just to try to give an explanation of why the decisions that we're choosing between with hypothesis testing are reject or fail to reject. I know some of you are wondering why the choices aren't reject and accept. And so what I'd like to do is just to use the analogy of a courtroom case to try to explain why this would be. When we're doing our research study, we set our null hypothesis, and it basically says that the means are equal. I'm going to show it this way, although you guys, I know, won't have seen this yet until you get to independent samples t-test. But basically we're saying there's no difference between the means. With a court case, our null hypothesis is that the person who is the defendant is presumed innocent. Okay? And they are presumed innocent until we prove that they're guilty. Now, in both scenarios, what we're going to do is we're going to collect data. Okay? With an experimental trial, we're going to set up some experiment. We're going to collect data on the participants. With the courtroom case, the lawyers are going to work and they're going to collect their evidence. And that's going to be what they're going to use. In both cases, this is what we're going to use to make our decision. Now, in an experimental study, after we've collected our data, we're going to do some sort of a statistical analysis. In a court trial, we're going to have the trial, obviously, and then our statistical analysis typically might be a decision that's made by the jury. Let me go back to the court case now. When we have the court case, the two decisions that the jury are allowed to render are either that the person is guilty, which means that the evidence proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that the person is guilty of the crime that they're charged with, or the decision is that they're not guilty. And what you'll notice, of course, is that the decision is not that the person is innocent. We started out with a presumption of innocence. We tried to prove that they were guilty. If we couldn't prove they were guilty, then we conclude that they are not guilty. With our statistical testing, we can either conclude to reject the null hypothesis, which means that the means are so different from one another that we believe that there's a true difference between them. Or, if they're not different enough, then we're going to fail to reject the null. And so we're not saying actually that the means are equal. We're not saying that they're equal. In fact, most times they won't be exactly equal. That'd be really unlikely. So we're just saying that they're not different enough, or in the court case, there's not enough evidence to show that they're guilty or that we're going to reject the null. Now, in both cases, what I think is kind of cool is that you can actually replicate the study, right? And if when you replicate it, you might reject the null this next time around, or you might fail to reject the null again. You could have a retrial over here, and you could find the person guilty the second time around, or you could say, well, there's still not enough evidence to show they're not guilty. Once we find that somebody's guilty, or once we reject the null, we usually think sort of that it's over, that we know the answer. Although obviously, in both situations, you could do it again and you could get a different result, and then you would have to decide how to sort of make sense out of those conflicting results. But what I really wanted to explain here is that this analogy hopefully makes sense to you a little bit. When we do our statistical analysis, we either have enough evidence to reject the null, or we don't. But if we don't, then all we're going to say is that we failed to demonstrate that the means are different from one another. Okay, I hope that's a big help. Hope you guys are doing well. Thanks.